She came on a Thursday. That detail matters somehow. Not a Monday when the week is still full of promise. Not a Friday when people are already halfway gone in their heads. A Thursday when the world is tired and honest, and there's nowhere left to hide behind the noise of the week. Callum was in the driveway when the car pulled up. He had the hood of his old Tacoma propped open and grease on his hands, and his daughter Amara was sitting on the front steps eating an apple, watching him the way 7-year-olds watch their parents. Like they're trying to memorize everything, just in case. The car was a black Audi, clean. The kind of clean that takes effort. Callum didn't look up right away. You learn not to, on Elgin Street. You let the car decide if it belongs before you give it your attention. But the engine cut and the door opened and there were heels on the asphalt and he looked up because the sound was wrong for the neighborhood. She was maybe 42. Dark coat, good posture. She had a leather folder tucked under one arm and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment like she was checking the address against something in her head. Amara stopped chewing her apple. The woman walked up the driveway. She didn't look around at the houses that were already looking at her. She looked at Callum. "Mr. Okafor," she said. Not a question. He wiped his hands on a rag that wasn't going to help. "That's right, my name is Sylvie Arsenault." She paused the way people pause when they think a name should mean something. "My father was Gerald Arsenault." Callum went very still. The Tacoma ticked in the quiet. Amara looked from the woman to her father and back again. She understood the way children understand things without knowing the words, that whatever this was, it was heavier than anything that had come for it on a Thursday afternoon. "Amara," Callum said without looking away from Sylvie Arsenault. "Go inside. Dad, please." She went. The screen door gave its small complaint, and then they were alone in the driveway with the smell of motor oil and the sound of the Andersons' wind chimes 2 houses down. Sylvie didn't move. She was waiting, Callum realized, waiting for him to say something. He didn't. "I know you have no reason to let me speak," she said. "I know that. I'm not here to ask for anything from you. I need you to know some things. And after that, whatever you decide, I'll go." Callum looked at her for a long time. "You can come in," he said finally. "I'll make coffee." He didn't know why he said it. Some things happen before the reasoning catches up. The kitchen was small and the table had a fruit bowl and a drawing Amara had done of what appeared to be a horse but might have been a dog, held to the fridge with a magnet from Niagara Falls. Sylvie sat and looked at none of it, or maybe she looked at all of it. The kind of looking that takes in everything at once because it needs to understand the full shape of what's been lost. Callum put the coffee on and stood with his back to her for a moment longer than necessary. "He died in February," Sylvie said. "I heard. The obituary didn't mention the Hartwell project. Or you. Obituaries don't usually mention the peoples you stepped on." He said it flat, not cruel, just factual. Sylvie absorbed that. "No, they don't." He turned around and leaned against the counter. Gerald Arsenault had been the founder and majority shareholder of Arsenault Infrastructure Partners, one of those quiet mid-size firms that worked municipal contracts across Ontario and occasionally Quebec. The kind of company that built things most people drove over without knowing someone's name. Callum had worked for them for 9 years. He'd been a project lead eventually. He'd been good at it. The Hartwell project was a bridge rehabilitation contract north of Barrie. 2 winters of work. Callum had flagged a subcontractor issue in the 2nd year. Materials not meeting spec, corners being cut in ways that wouldn't show up until they needed to. He'd put it in writing. He'd escalated. Gerald Arsenault had thanked him for the memo, and 2 weeks later, Callum was off the project. 30 days after that, his contract wasn't renewed. It was all very clean, no stated reason, no paper trail that pointed anywhere specific. Just a man who had spent 9 years building something, standing in a parking lot in January with a box of personal items and the feeling that the floor had opened under him. His wife had left the year before. Amara was 4. He had a mortgage on the Elgin Street house and 3 weeks of severance and a reference letter that was technically positive and said nothing. "I found the file," Sylvie said. Callum looked at her. Dad kept files on everything. He was meticulous, I'll give him that. There are 8 filing cabinets in his home office and I've been going through them since March. She set the leather folder on the table. He kept a record of the Hartwell situation, your memos, the engineering reports, the decision process. She slid the folder toward him, and his own notes. Callum didn't touch it. What kind of notes? The kind where he admits he knew you were right. Her voice didn't waver, but something behind it did. "You were right about the subcontractor. They retested the materials 8 months after you were let go. The lot failed. They replaced the supplier, quietly, and no one ever mentioned why. The bridge opened on schedule. Gerald got a commendation from the municipality. She looked down at the folder. And you were in Guelph trying to find work with a reference letter that, if you read it carefully enough, damns with very faint praise. The coffee maker finished. Neither of them moved. "Why are you here?" Callum said. And it wasn't a question exactly. It was something more like a door he was deciding whether to open. "Because what was done to you was wrong," Sylvie said. "And my father is gone and I can't make him face it, and I'm the one who has to decide what to do with what he left behind." She looked at him steadily. "I'm the CEO now, the company is mine, and I want to make this right." The neighborhood had been watching since she'd come up the driveway. This is the thing about places like Elgin Street. Not poor exactly, not prosperous, just real. People notice the foreign thing and they keep noticing it until it makes sense or goes away. By the time Sylvie's Audi was still parked at the curb at 4 o'clock, 3 sets of curtains had made their small adjustments. Callum's neighbor Keith knocked on the back door around 4:15 with the stated reason of returning a drill and the actual reason of checking on things. Callum told him he was fine, and Keith lingered long enough to establish that the woman in the kitchen did not appear to be a threat or a debt collector, which were the 2 categories that produced that particular model of car in that neighborhood, and then he went home. Inside, Callum had finally opened the folder. He'd read it slowly. The coffee went cold. Sylvie didn't fill the silence with anything. She just let him read, and he respected her for that, even though he hadn't decided to respect her for anything yet. Gerald's notes were in a cramped executive hand. The kind of handwriting men develop when they've spent decades in rooms where decisions are made, and they need to get things down fast. There were abbreviations Callum didn't recognize and references to conversations he hadn't been part of, and in the margin of a printed email, Callum's own email, the one flagging the subcontractor issue, Gerald had written, "He's right, but timing is wrong. Fortino situation, can't afford the delay. Deal with personnel after." That was it. That was the whole thing. He's right. Deal with personnel after. Callum had wondered for 4 years if he'd missed something, if he'd escalated wrong or read the situation wrong, or if there was some larger context in which what happened to him made a kind of professional sense he just couldn't see from where he stood. He'd carried that uncertainty the way you carry a stone. Not all the time, but always there, in the weight of it. He hadn't been wrong. Gerald Arsenault had known he was right and buried him anyway for the sake of a deadline and a contract with someone named Fortino. The stone was still there, but now it had a shape. "What does making it right mean?" Callum said. He set the folder down. "It means several things. Legally." She paused, measured. "Legally, there are constraints. It's been 4 years. Wrongful dismissal has a limitation clock, and that's run. I won't pretend otherwise. Then it's acknowledgement. Paper. It's more than paper. But yes, it starts with acknowledgement." She reached into the folder and produced a second document. "This is a letter on company letterhead, signed by me. It states that your employment was terminated in a manner that was unjust and not a reflection of your performance or professional judgment. It invites you to list it as a reference and use my name directly." She placed it in front of him. "It also, if you're willing, opens the door to a consulting arrangement. Hartwell Phase 2 starts planning next spring. I'd like you involved." Callum looked at the letter. "That's not enough." "I know." Her voice was quiet but clear. "There's also a financial component, not damages, legally. But I have discretion over how the company handles things. My father's estate includes a professional development fund he used selectively. I've restructured it." She named a number. Callum made himself not react. It was significant. It was the kind of number that would mean Amara's university without a student loan, or the Elgin Street mortgage gone, or both, if he was careful. "Why?" he said again. This time the door was more open. Sylvie looked at him directly. She had the kind of face that had learned, somewhere along the way, not to perform emotion, that real things don't need performance. "Because I went through 8 filing cabinets," she said. "And your file wasn't the only one. But it was the worst. And I have to start somewhere. There is a moment in certain conversations where the math shifts, where the question stops being what does this person want and becomes what kind of person are they. Callum had spent enough years in boardrooms and site meetings to know when someone was running a play, and he'd spent enough years in his kitchen at 7 a.m. with Amara and her cereal and her questions to know when someone was just being honest. He took the letter. He didn't say yes to anything else yet. "I need to think," he said. "Of course, I need to talk to a lawyer. You should. I'll provide disclosure to any solicitor you're in fully. I'll answer any question, and if I decide no, then I'll go. And the letter is still yours, no conditions." He looked at her then, really looked. Sylvie Arsenault was the kind of tired that comes not from lack of sleep but from a particular kind of reckoning. The kind where you go through your father's cabinets and find out, drawer by drawer, the precise shape of who he was. Not in a CEO. In people he knew. Did you know? He asked. Before he died, did you know any of it? She didn't look away. I knew the company's culture. I knew my father was hard. I didn't know specifics, a beat. I should have looked sooner. That's mine to carry. Outside, a car went down Elgin Street with the bass turned up. A dog barked twice, normal Thursday sounds. Come back next week, Callum said. I'll have an answer. She nodded and she stood and she picked up the folder, leaving the letter on the table. At the kitchen doorway, she stopped. For what it's worth, she said. The bridge is solid, because of what you did. Callum didn't say anything to that, but he didn't dismiss it either. He walked her to the door and stood on the steps while she went down the driveway to the clean black Audi. The sun was getting low and the street had that particular October light, the kind that makes even ordinary things look briefly significant, like the world is deciding what to keep. He thought about his father, too, a man who'd worked 30 years in a fabricating shop in Hamilton and never once bent a rule, not because it was easy, but because he didn't see another way to be. Who'd told Callum once that the thing about doing right is it doesn't always pay out when you need it to, so you'd better not be doing it for the payout. He'd thought about those words more times than he could count, especially the years when they'd felt more like a sentence than wisdom. Amara was at the table with homework when he came back inside. She was 7 and she was serious about second grade the way she was serious about everything. Full attention, pencil held correctly. Who was that? She said, without looking up. Someone from work. Old work. Is she nice? Callum picked up the letter from the table and looked at it. The company letterhead was clean, a little austere. His name was spelled correctly, which was not as given as it should have been. The language was careful and unambiguous. I think so, he said. Amara considered this. She smelled nice too, she offered, still writing, like the fancy soap at Grandma's. Callum put the letter on the counter and started making dinner. Pasta and the jar sauce Amara liked that had the little flecks of basil. While the water heated, he stood at the window and watched the street go about its evening business. Keith hosing the driveway, the retired couple from the corner walking their old beagle, the lights coming on in the houses one by one. What Sylvie Sarceneau was offering him was not a reversal. That was the thing he kept coming back to. You couldn't reverse 4 years. You couldn't reverse the January morning he'd cleared his desk. You couldn't put back the contract or the professional momentum or the particular kind of confidence that gets eroded when the ground proves less solid than you built on. But you could, maybe, name what happened. You could have it acknowledged in writing by the people who'd done it. You could build on a foundation that had at least been looked at, even if you couldn't fix every crack. He called his mother that night after Amara was in bed. She lived in Hamilton still, the same house. He told her the broad shape of what had happened. What are you going to do? She asked. I'm not sure yet. What does your gut say? He thought about it. That she means it. Well, his mother said. Then maybe let her. He called a lawyer the next day. A woman named Davies who worked out of a firm on Stone Road in Guelph that had a good reputation for employment matters and didn't advertise heavily, which Callum had always taken as a good sign. He laid out the situation. Davies listened carefully and asked good questions and told him that yes, the limitation period had passed, and yes, the offer was unusual, and no, there was nothing inherently suspicious in the structure she described. The question, Davies said, is whether what's being offered matches what was taken. Legally, you have no leverage. Practically, it's about what you need to be able to move forward. What do you think she's getting out of it? Davies was quiet for a moment. Probably the ability to run her father's company without knowing this is sitting in the basement. That's not a bad reason. Doesn't mean it isn't also the right thing. He thought about that for several days. Sylvie came back the following Thursday. Same time, as if time itself had a preference for consistency. This time Amara was at her grandmother's and the house was quiet in a different way. Callum had the folder open on the table already when the knock came. They sat down and he asked the questions Davies had helped him draft and Sylvie answered them directly and without consulting any notes, which told him she'd been over this enough times in her own head to have the answers somewhere deep. She didn't soften anything. When he asked what had happened to the Fortino contract, she told him, plainly, that Fortino Construction had been dropped 18 months ago for unrelated issues and that her father's relationship with them had been, in her assessment, a liability the company had been lucky to exit. So he protected them, Callum said, and then they became a problem anyway. Yes, and I was wrong for nothing. Sylvie looked at him steadily. You were discarded for a relationship that rotted anyway. Yes. He picked up the pen she'd brought and he signed the consulting agreement. Not because it was perfect, not because it erased what 4 years felt like, but because it was true, and Forward and Amara had 2 more years before the university conversation started, and the Elgin Street mortgage didn't care about the principle of the thing, and because his gut said she meant it. The work started in March. Hartwell Phase 2, a full-deck replacement and structural upgrade on the section north of Essa Road. Callum drove up on the first planning day and walked the site with the new project engineer, a young man named Davies, no relation, who was meticulous and asked good questions. Sylvie wasn't on site. She ran the company from the Toronto office, and she wasn't the kind of CEO who needed to be photographed at project launches. He appreciated that. What he found was that the work itself was the same as it had always been. You looked at a thing and you figured out what it needed, and you applied the right solution in the right sequence, and you documented everything, because documentation is how you prove you were there. He was good at it. He'd always been good at it. Gerald Arsenault hadn't changed that by putting his name on a termination notice. He'd just made it harder to do for a while. There's a particular pleasure in a job that knows what it is. Bridges are honest things. They either hold or they don't, and all the politics and the Fortino relationships and the executive decisions made in warm offices can't change the physics of it. He'd always loved that. He'd forgotten in the fallow years how much. He called his mother on a Tuesday in April when the site was muddy from a warm rain and the crew had knocked off early, and he was standing by his truck looking at the river below, which was running high and clear with snowmelt. "How's it going?" she asked. "Good," he said. "It's good. And the woman, the CEO? I talked to her last week. About Phase 3 planning. Is it strange?" He thought about it. "Less than I expected." A pause. "She's competent. She sees things clearly. That's not nothing." "No, it's not." Amara, when he told her vaguely that the old work situation had been sorted out, had looked up from her homework and said, "So the lady was nice." And he'd said yes, she was. And Amara had nodded and gone back to her fractions with the settled air of someone who'd already closed the file on the matter. You never really know, with these things, what the lasting shape is going to be. A moment feels permanent. The January parking lot, the box of personal items, the reference letter with its carefully engineered vagueness. And then time does what time does. It doesn't erase, but it contextualizes. It puts things in relation to everything that came after. Gerald Arsenault's obituary ran 5 paragraphs in the Toronto Star and mentioned his decades of service to the industry and his philanthropic contributions and his love of sailing. It did not mention Route 9. It did not mention the Fortino contract. It did not mention Callum Okafor, who was at home that morning making lunches and reading the obituary on his phone and thinking about a man he'd never entirely known but who'd occupied a significant amount of real estate in his interior life for 4 years. He'd felt something reading it, not grief, not satisfaction. Something quieter than either. The kind of feeling you get when a long question finally gets an answer, and the answer turns out to be ordinary. Not a revelation, just a fact. Gerald Arsenault had been a man who knew how to build things and knew how to protect them, and occasionally those two projects came into conflict, and he'd chosen the project over the person. A lot of people did that. It didn't make it right. It made it human, in the worst sense. The building in the October light. Callum had thought about that image more than once, since Sylvie had told him plainly what the files said. There's something about a structure that's been stress-tested, that's held against the thing that might have broken it. That looks different afterward. Not stronger necessarily, just more honestly itself. Elgin Street in the spring was a different thing from Elgin Street in October. The tulips Amara had planted along the front walk came up a little crooked, but they came up purple and white, and she'd stood looking at them one morning with her hands on her hips in a posture that was entirely her grandmother's, satisfied and unsurprised. Callum stood in the doorway watching her. He thought about the Thursday the black Audi had pulled up, the way Amara had stopped chewing her apple, the way he'd told her to go inside, and she had, reluctantly, carrying her uncertainty with the compliance of a kid, trusted her father more than she trusted the situation. He'd been trying to give her that. Not safety exactly, you can't promise safety, but something underneath safety. The sense that when things go wrong, you face them. You find out the truth. You make decisions based on what's actually there. And when someone comes to you and tells you something was wrong and offers what they can offer, you don't have to forgive everything, but you can choose what to do with what's left. Amara was going to be all right. He'd known it for a while, but spring has a way of making you say the thing out loud in your head, making it real in a way the gray months don't. She was going to be all right because she'd seen what people do with hard things. The tulips came up crooked, but they came up. That was enough. That had always been enough.